Your home is supposed to be a place of safety and comfort, but what happens when it turns into a setting for something terrifying? Today, we'll be hearing some of the scariest, creepiest, and most disturbing things people have ever experienced right in their own homes. You won't want to miss these chilling stories. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm creating these videos to help raise funds for my dad's medical treatment, and your support makes a huge difference. If you'd like to contribute, the GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and now, let's dive into these unsettling experiences. Story 1. When I was 14, my family had just moved into a big, run-down farmhouse. It wasn't in the best shape, but it was cheap to rent. The house was surrounded by a cornfield, and the closest neighbors were pretty far away, which made the place feel even more isolated. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up because I heard the hallway lights click on. I've always been a really light sleeper. A few minutes later, my dog started whining and scratching at my bedroom door. I got up to let him in, and he crawled under my bed like he sometimes did, but he had never woken me up like this before. I felt a little uneasy, but figured it was nothing and went back to sleep. Sometime later, I woke up again, this time to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. Through my grogginess, I noticed fingers wrapped around the edge of the door, slowly pushing it open. Half asleep, I asked, "Who is it?" A voice, clearly trying to sound like a woman, responded, saying they were my mother and were just checking on me. I kept saying, "No, you don't sound like my mother," but the voice kept insisting. At this point, I still wasn't fully awake, but something felt really wrong. Then the door opened wider, and I saw a hand followed by an arm. That's when it hit me, the person was coming into my room. Panic surged through me, and I started screaming. My dog, who had been under the bed, jumped out and lunged at the door. The person quickly shut the door, and I never got a clear look at them. By now, my mum had woken up from my screaming. She rushed down the hall, shouting if I was okay. When she reached my room, she told me she had seen a large figure standing outside my door, wearing something like stockings over their head. When she screamed, the person ran down a back staircase we had in the house that looked like a closet, so they must have known the layout or planned to hide. They bolted out the back door and into the cornfield. Nothing was stolen, and it didn't seem like the person was there for anything other than to get into my room. Even now, thinking about it gives me chills. I've never really been the same since that night. Just the memory of it makes me feel incredibly anxious. Story 2. This happened about a year ago. Mai and I live in a 2-story house with our dog, Benny. One night, at around 3 a.m., Benny went downstairs, presumably to use the bathroom. Suddenly, he started freaking out, barking and hopping around by the doggy door, which was swaying like something had just gone through it. The door leads to a small side yard, basically a dog run. At first I thought it was probably the wind, or maybe Benny pawed at the door before I came down. But Mai was scared, so I grabbed a flashlight, threw on some shoes, and went outside to check. I scanned the front yard, nothing. Then I flashed my light into the side yard again, nothing. It felt weird, but I was about to head back inside and tell Benny to settle down. Just as I was about to turn back, something in my gut told me to check the side yard again. This time, I walked around the front to get a better angle. Slowly, I swept my flashlight over the pitch-black dog run. And then I saw him. Pressed up against the wall, like he was trying to disappear into it, was a middle-aged white guy dressed head to toe in black. He was crouched low, staring straight at me, his eyes gleaming in the beam of my flashlight. My mind went straight into fight or flight mode. "What the fuck are you doing in my yard?" I yelled. He started walking toward me, but there was a tall gate separating the dog run from the front yard. He mumbled something about being lost and looking for Stacy's house. Lost, he wanted me to let him out. That's when I realized something. Because Benny had been jumping the fence, we installed extra high posts along the gate, making it impossible to open from the inside. The guy was trapped. "Fuck you. You're not going anywhere," I snapped, telling Mike to call the cops. It was then that I noticed he was clearly drunk. Realizing I wasn't letting him go, he started slamming his body against the wooden fence until he broke several posts and stumbled away down the street. The cops found him about 2 hours later, wandering around an elementary school parking lot without his pants on. They never found his pants. Story 3. I live alone, renting the first floor of an old house. My entrance and bathroom are additions to the original structure, which makes everything a bit creaky. One morning, during the dead of a Canadian winter, I was taking a shower when I heard the bathroom door unlatch and creak open. Not too unusual in an old house like Minute, happens occasionally with the drafts. As I stood there, I weighed my options. On one hand, I could ignore it and continue showering, but the bathroom would quickly get cold. On the other hand, I could reach out and shut the door, suffering the temporary indignity of a freezing arm. I should mention that my eyesight is terrible without glasses, so everything's a blur at the best of times. I decided to stick my head out of the shower, just to see what was going on. That's when I saw it, or rather them. A fuzzy, hospital green blob filling most of the bathroom. And then the blob started shouting something at me in a loud, incomprehensible voice. At this point, I'm proud to say that I emitted a reasonably manly, low-pitched "hotbha" instead of the high-pitched squeal that was trying to escape. The blob kept shouting at me, and I was standing there, naked and confused, repeatedly saying, "Yes, what, hello, why, what." Eventually, I managed to understand, through the shouting and thick Caribbean accent, that the person in front of me was a housekeeper. Apparently, they hadn't read the landlord's instructions to only clean the second and third floors. Instead of knocking or announcing their presence in a normal way, they had silently stalked into my bathroom while I was very obviously in the middle of a shower, only to start shouting at me after I stuck my head out. It was not the most pleasant way to start the morning, to say the least. Story 4. About 4 years ago, my doorbell rang in the middle of the night. I groggily got up and looked out the window. We lived on the second floor of a duplex, but the front entrance was at ground level, leading to a private stairwell. Standing on the porch was a man, just standing there, not knocking or saying anything. I watched him for a minute, confused. He wandered next door, then to the house after that, before turning back toward my place. My wife, alarmed, had already called 911 to report this suspicious person. As he reached our front sidewalk again, the police arrived. They got out of their car, told him to place his hands on the hood, and began emptying his pockets. From my living room window, I could clearly see a gun among the items they pulled out. My heart dropped. The officers quickly bagged his belongings, cuffed him, and placed him in the back of the police cruiser. After that, I didn't hear another thing. No follow-up, no explanation. Needless to say, I didn't sleep a wink that night. Story 5. When I was much younger, my sister, who was around 9 or 10, somehow got locked out of the house late at night. To this day, no one knows how. She's always been the quiet type and wore hearing aids that she took out at night, so communication wasn't easy. The whole thing was really odd, and the details are a bit hazy, but it was unsettling. Eventually, after what must have been hours, she started knocking, and my mom let her in around 11 p.m. That was nearly 3 hours after our usual bedtime. The strangest part was that my sister acted like nothing happened. She just went upstairs, totally unfazed, even though she had been locked out of the house, in the cold, for who knows how long. Naturally, we asked her about it the next morning. Her response? "Oh, it's okay. I was sleeping outside." Wait, what? Sleeping outside? Completely out of character for her. She just casually explained that she had gone downstairs and fallen asleep outside, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Later that day, after we got home from school, we walked by the bathroom window and noticed something strange. There were barefoot footprints and what looked like claw marks on the side of the house, right under the window. Deep, vicious-looking scratches and dirty footmarks trailing up the wall. "Hey sis, was that you?" I asked, a bit uneasy. "Nah," she replied casually. "Are you sure?" I pressed. "Yeah," she said, like it wasn't even worth a second thought. And that was it. I didn't question it further, and it never happened again. At the time, I was too young to think much of it, but looking back now, I can't help but wonder what on earth was that all about. Story 6. I was trapped in one of the most intense, lucid nightmares I'd ever experienced. In the dream, I became convinced that my parents were in terrible danger, and I had to contact them immediately. Even though I was fully aware I was dreaming, the fear and desperation were all too real. I knew I had to wake up, or somehow reach them from within the dream. Frantically, I searched for a way to get through, and that's when a strange, spirit-like presence appeared. It guided me to this bizarre, old-fashioned contraption, a mess of levers, dials, buttons, and switches, all of which needed to be wound up to function. I was panicking, pressing, jabbing, and winding as quickly as I could. Finally, the machine sparked to life, and through a faint, crackling ringtone, I heard my mother's voice say, "Hello." That's when I woke up, lying in my bed, completely disoriented, but slowly calming down from the nightmare. The dream had been so vivid, but I reassured myself it was just that, a dream. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was my mum. She asked why I had called her from the house phone only moments before Anne hung up without saying a word. The problem was, the house phone is 3 floors away from my bedroom, and I had never sleepwalked in my life. Yet somehow, the call had happened right before I woke up. Story 7. When I was 10 years old, my parents bought a condemned house, with plans to renovate it ourselves. It was supposed to be a year-long project. During the signing of the papers, the former owner casually mentioned that her brother, Jimmy, who had been in prison for the last 10 years, was about to be released. She told us, almost nonchalantly, that Jimmy had a split personality. One moment, he was an angel. The next, he had a shotgun pointed at your face. Needless to say, as a kid, I was nervous. But the papers were already signed, and we were locked into the deal. Months passed, and we were deep into the renovation. One day, we pulled up to the house to find the driveway barricaded, with all of our construction equipment blocking our path. And, to top it off, someone had defecated on our front porch. It was Jimmy. He had done this to intimidate us. We called the cops and filed a restraining order against him, and for a while, we didn't hear from him. Eventually, we learned more about why Jimmy had been in prison. One night, he and a friend got drunk, and his friend mentioned wanting to kill himself. Jimmy, instead of talking him down, decided to help. He found a stick and stabbed his friend, killing him. But it didn't stop there. He poured wax over his friend's eyes, cut him into pieces, and scattered the body parts around town. He also killed someone in prison, but that was apparently self-defense. We finished renovating the house and moved in, but Jimmy was still on my mind. I shared a room with my brothers, and our room was right next to the front porch. For months, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jimmy was out there, lurking outside my window, waiting to pour wax over my eyes like he had with his friend. Then one day, after several months of no contact, Jimmy showed up. He came to our door, saying he wanted to apologize for what he'd done to the house. We were all standing at the door, watching my dad talk to him outside. My dad firmly told him to leave, and that was the last time we ever saw Jimmy. He never physically hurt us, but just knowing what he was capable of, and the thought of him being so close to us for so long, kept me on edge for a long time. Story 8. I moved into a house built in 1890 and have been doing a lot of rehabbing to restore it. One day, I decided to cut a hole in the kitchen ceiling to run a vent. As I began digging through the old layers, I found the ceiling was packed with leaves, bits of old newspapers, some in German, and various other bits of rubbish. After pulling out the first few handfuls, I came across something strange: a long, 24-inch section of a woman's red hair. I had heard that they sometimes used human hair to insulate houses back in the day, so I wasn't completely freaked out, just a bit grossed out. But then, I spotted something that really made me uneasy: an old baby shoe sticking out of the debris. Keep in mind, I couldn't actually see into the hole as it was above me, so I had no idea what else might be inside. At that moment, I thought to myself, there better not be a damn leg bone sticking out of this shoe. Thankfully, there wasn't, but as I kept pulling, I found not just one, but 3 shoes: a baby shoe, a toddler shoe, and a woman's adult shoe. They were all from the early 20th century, I believe. My guess is that the attic space above the kitchen somehow opened into the walls. And over the years, random objects, some possibly dropped, some perhaps intentionally placed, fell into the ceiling. But still, that baby shoe really creeped me out. Story 9. My apartment building is strange. It feels like it screams sometimes. The building has 3 apartments, so there aren't many people around. When you leave my apartment, there's a small hallway that leads outside to the front of the building. One night, my boyfriend and 2 friends were standing in that hallway when they all heard a scream. It wasn't coming from any of the apartments, but my friend said it sounded like it came from right behind him in the hallway. The second time it happened, I was in my room with my headphones on, doing homework. I thought I heard a scream downstairs, but I dismissed it since I had music playing. 5 minutes later, my roommate came into my room asking if I'd heard it. She'd been in the kitchen when she heard it outside in the hallway. She said it was loud and quick and sounded like a woman. Then, the other night, my boyfriend and I were about to go out to eat. We were walking down the stairwell and halfway out the front door when we heard it right behind us, like it was in the stairwell. At first, when I heard the other 2 stories, I figured it was just a girl from the second apartment, since one apartment is all boys and the other has 2 girls. But it wasn't coming from an apartment, because the sound would have been muffled by the thick walls. This scream was definitely in the stairwell with us. ... None of us have any explanation for it. We even tried walking around the stairwell, attempting to recreate the sound with creaking floorboards or squeaky doors, but nothing worked. Story 10. Last summer, we decided to repaint my room after having the same color for a decade. After a couple of coats, we left it to dry. A few hours later, we came back, and the paint was perfectly dry except for one thick streak on the wall that was melting. The old paint color started coming back through as the new paint dripped down. It was really odd. We joked about it being a ghost, but it still freaked me out. Not long after, my sister and I were hanging out in the kitchen, getting something to drink. She set her glass down for a moment, and out of nowhere, it exploded. It was as if someone shot the glass. Shards flew all over the kitchen. We were stunned. I knew that a change in temperature could crack glass, but she had poured room temperature liquid into it. The glass didn't have any cracks before it didn't just crack, it exploded. In the end, there were explanations. Apparently, glass can sometimes explode due to nickel sulfide in the glass that reacts slowly over time, and the dripping paint. It was in a part of the wall where the air conditioning vent ran, and with a stupidly hot day, we had the AC blasting. No poltergeist, but at the time, these 2 incidents definitely freaked me out. Story 11. Many years ago, when I was around 21, I was staying at my parents' house after finishing university, figuring out what to do with my life. During those carefree days, I often went out at night to party and would return in the early hours of the morning. As my parents were light sleepers, I'd always try to creep in as quietly as possible. One fine midnight hour, I returned, having arrived at the house under the glow of a crescent moon. I tiptoed up the gravel driveway, gently turned the key in the lock, padded to the spare bedroom, and quietly closed the door behind me. I was a little tipsy and still in the spirit of night camouflage, so I kept the light off, stood behind the door, and began to undress. But as I pulled off my top, I suddenly noticed that the door behind me seemed to be opening on its own. Remaining calm, I stopped undressing and instinctively moved behind the door, as it slowly creaked open. Thinking it was my mum or dad, since there was no one else in the house, I, admittedly a bit drunk, craned my neck around and in a theatrical, friendly voice said, "Hello." That's when all hell broke loose. The moment I spoke, I was met with blood-curdling screams and the sound of frantic movement in the hallway. I quickly switched on the bedroom light and rushed into the hallway, only to be greeted by more screams of horror, terror, and utter madness. Down the hall, I saw my mother, completely naked, a somewhat rotund woman with enormous boobs facing me in sheer panic. She stumbled backward into the cupboards, flailing her arms in terror, her screams growing louder as she saw me. Her short-sightedness and panic had taken over, and she no longer recognized me. In her mind, I had transformed into some kind of nightmarish intruder. Despite my friendly hello just moments before, she was convinced that I wasn't her son. For a good 15 seconds, I stood there saying, "Mum, it's me." But all that did was send her into another fit of hysterical screaming. The commotion woke up my dad, who emerged from their bedroom, bleary-eyed and bewildered in his dressing gown, only to find my naked wife hyperventilating against the closet doors, and me, confused and in boxer shorts, looking at him with a mix of desperation and mild amusement. It was terrifying for Mum and surreal for me. Story 12. I was 13 when it all started. One night, I woke up to the sound of children laughing outside my window. I had an 11-year-old brother with friends next door, so I thought nothing of it. This continued for a few nights, and I eventually got annoyed. I told my little brother to knock it off, threatening to give him a noogie or something. He gave me a poker face and said he could hear them too. I figured he was just being a dork. That night, I heard the laughter again. I got up and opened the window, ready to yell at him and his friends. But when I looked outside, I froze. Standing there were 4 or 5 silhouettes, darker than the night itself, about the size of toddlers. As soon as I screamed, they vanished. My dad went outside to check, but of course, he didn't see anything. I didn't hear the laughter for a while, but a few nights later, it came back. The first time, I panicked and slept in the living room. The second time, I gathered my courage and peeked outside again. There they were, those same dark figures, just standing there in the yard. I don't know what possessed me, but I grabbed a Bible, held it up like I was in a 70s horror movie, and screamed, "In the name of the Father and the Son, I command you to leave and never return." After that, I never heard the laughter again. I guess they were too busy laughing at me somewhere else. Story 13. My roommate somehow scored a large amount of weed for an absurdly low price. The buds were decent, but nothing special, so she decided to make a massive batch of THC-infused cookies instead of just smoking it. I watched her make some very potent ganja butter, and after trying one of the cookies, I had an amazing trip. The kind of experience you wish marijuana still gave you. A few days later, I was home watching a movie with a girl, when my 3 roommates came back with 2 people. One I knew, and the other, let's call him Brian, I had never seen before. After the movie, I took the girl home and came back, where I was offered one of those potent cookies. I scarfed it down quickly. Apparently, my roommates had one too, and Brian and his friend Kelsey split one. About 20 minutes later, Brian started to show signs of being way too high. Usually, this isn't a big deal, and the person just falls asleep, but Brian wasn't having it. He started to freak out. We offered him some water and a place to lie down, which he accepted and disappeared into the back of the house. A little later, we heard voices from the back, and Kelsey went to investigate. She found that Brian had somehow called the police, telling the dispatcher that he'd been poisoned and was trapped in our house. Brian then ran into the living room in his boxers, stormed outside, and we had no choice but to chase after him. We couldn't have a panicked, pantless 20-something parading around outside at 7:30 p.m. While we were outside, my roommate grabbed the phone to try and clear things up. By then, all the dispatcher wanted was our address to send the police. We quickly hid some other, unrelated evidence in my room, but intentionally left the cookies on the table. The cops arrived soon after, looking ready to make an arrest. But before they could even say much, Brian came barreling around the corner and almost ran right into them. At first, he was stunned, but then he did something that had all of us screaming inside our heads. Please don't shoot him. Brian actually tapped one of the officers' belts, pretended to steal his gun, and pointed it at the officers, making shooting noises. We were all baked out of our minds, screaming internally, "Don't shoot him in our house." To the officers' credit, they stayed calm and didn't react, understanding that Brian was way too messed up to be taken seriously. Brian then tried to run, but the officers quickly tackled him and threw him on the couch. They asked us what he had taken, and we told them, a half of a marijuana cookie. They then asked if we had also eaten any, and we admitted we had. They asked who made them, and we sheepishly said, we did. At that point, I fully expected to be searched and arrested. I resigned myself to it, just hoping I wouldn't make things worse. But Brian had other ideas. He was so out of it, he started yelling about Jesus and kicking at the officers. We had to keep reassuring them that all he had was half a marijuana cookie. It got so out of hand that they called for backup. Things escalated even further, and they ended up calling an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, they brought the total number of uniformed personnel in our house to 12. After explaining the situation, one of the paramedics pulled out a needle and injected it into Brian's leg, reassuring him it would help him feel better and fall asleep. But the effects weren't instant. About 30 seconds later, Brian was still screaming, and the paramedics strapped him to a gurney and wheeled him out. Throughout all of this, the cops never asked for anyone's name, ID, or any other info. They didn't search the house or anything. As the medics left, so did the cops, offering only one piece of advice: no more cookies for this guy. Story 14. This didn't happen in my house, but it happened near my house, and it was by far the creepiest thing that ever happened to me, so I had to share it. I was driving home from my then-girlfriend's house around midnight. It was summer, very hot, and it had rained earlier that evening, so there was a heavy fog hanging in the air. I had to drive down Route 17, a really old road that ran between where I lived and where she lived. It passed through Burkesville, the town made famous by the Blair Witch Project. I was driving through an area with mostly old, run-down farms. The road had a lot of sharp turns, so I was going slow. As I was coming around a bend, I suddenly saw an old man walking across the road. I slammed on the brakes and braced myself for impact, knowing there was no way I could stop in time. I remember the old man turning and looking right at me as my car was about to hit him. His mouth opened, and it looked like he was screaming but then, as my car reached the spot where he was, he vanished. My car finally skidded to a stop, and I wasn't sure what had just happened. I didn't hear any thud on my car, so I immediately got out and looked around for a body. I didn't see anything. I went to the front of my car, but there was no damage. I walked behind the car a few feet, and still, I couldn't see anything. I must have walked 40 or 50 feet before I started getting really freaked out. Then, I heard footsteps coming from the darkness. By that point, I almost lost it and sprinted back to my car. The fear was so intense, I could barely breathe. The next morning, I told my mum the story, and just telling it gave me goosebumps. My mum, who usually doesn't believe in the paranormal, looked at my arms and said, "Just by your reaction, I believe you." To this day, I'm not sure what I saw. It could have just been the fog playing tricks on me, but it felt so real. Later on, I found out I wasn't the only one who had seen an old man crossing that same stretch of road. Story 15. One rented a farmhouse in rural Iowa while attending college, and the owner gave me strict instructions. Under no circumstances should I go into the attic, and I should only use the basement for storage. At first, I had a roommate and friend who loved the house. She was enchanted by the photos of the place, but when she arrived, she had a complete meltdown, claiming the house was haunted and cursed. She never visited again. I didn't believe in that stuff, so I didn't let it bother me. I was okay with her avoiding it though, since I didn't want her to feel uncomfortable. The basement was a strange place. It smelled heavily of wet dirt and had an old coal room that was partially collapsed. It made an eerie, creaking sound every time air rushed down the shaft. There were 3 other rooms. One looked like a bathroom, but felt more like something out of a horror movie. It was about 15 feet by 15, with exposed beams, pipes, chipped paint on the brick walls, and a drain in the cement floor. There was a surgical tray next to the toilet, and a shredded rubber curtain hung as a shower. The toilet itself looked straight out of Fallout 3. Dark stains covered the floor, and there was a rotten mattress shoved in the corner. Another room seemed like a canning area, with cabinets full of pickled food from years ago. I couldn't tell what the food was, but it looked like meat, specifically pig parts. Since the farm had once been a pig farm, and maybe some fruit. The last person to live there had been in the 70s. The main room, where the stove and sink were, doubled as the living room. For years, the landline phone in that room would ring every few hours, even though it wasn't connected. The phone stopped ringing in the 4th year I lived there, just before I moved out. I answered it once, trying to troubleshoot, but it was dead on the other end. Similarly, the lights in the house would flicker and turn on or off for no reason. The attic was locked with a few padlocks, and despite my curiosity, I resisted the urge to go in for 4 years. The door to the attic was in the bathroom, so every day I'd see it there, mostly painted over even the locks. Eventually though, the constant warnings from the landlord and my own curiosity started to wear on me. One day, I started hearing scratching sounds coming from the attic, heavy, not the typical sounds of rats. I figured it was some animal, but I didn't want to bother the landlord since he was in the hospital, and his mother had just passed. My bedroom was right next to the bathroom and attic door, and the scratching grew louder. It started to keep me up at night. Then, one day, I drove home and noticed that the window in the attic, which had been covered with brown paper for years, was now ripped down, and there was a chair sitting in front of it. I couldn't see more from the outside, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I finally decided to check the attic for myself. My friend and I unscrewed the locks and went up. The staircase was weak and covered in a layer of dust, and the air in the attic smelled rancid like rotten wood and old food. The space was packed with shoeboxes, stacked from floor to ceiling. At first, I didn't see the window with the chair, but I did see scratches on the floor, big enough to suggest a raccoon or some other large animal. My friend, curious, opened one of the boxes. Inside was a pile of newspaper, and in the center, a plain glass cup. Nothing special, but it was odd to find it in such a random spot. We opened more boxes, each containing the same newspapers and a plain cup at the center. We couldn't find any droppings or signs of an animal, though we guessed there might be a shit corner somewhere behind the boxes. As we continued exploring, we found a wall lined with dozens of crutches. They were arranged strangely, which made us wonder if someone with polio had lived there. But it was odd there was no explanation for their display. Finally, we found the chair in front of the window. It had a shawl or blanket draped over it, but the ripped paper around the window clearly indicated someone had been there recently. We also discovered several huge chests. When we opened one, we found stacks of old porn magazines, some dating back to World War II and the 1970s. Each cover had strange titles in all caps. The Hair, EYES, All Legs. It looked like my landlord had written these titles himself. We quickly put everything back as it was and left the attic, locking the door behind us. I stayed in the house for another month before moving out, as I had already planned to move once I graduated. The experience stayed with me though, and I've never been able to shake the feeling of what I found up there. That is all for today. If you have enjoyed this video, do like and subscribe and let me know below of your thoughts. If you want to help in my dad's fundraiser, I would truly appreciate it. Hope you have an absolutely amazing day. You can also check my other videos on screen.